Imagine arriving home to a house that looks untouched, but something inside is irrevocably broken. A body, a mystery that will sit in a file for more than 2 decades. This is the story of Sherri Rasmussen, a young nurse found brutally murdered one winter night in 1986. And the twist that would shock Los Angeles. The killer was, at the time, a member of the LAPD. You'll hear about forensic breakthroughs, quiet cover-ups, the smallest scraps of DNA, and an interrogation that unfolded like a carefully written trap. We'll unpack how detectives who reopened a cold file in the 2000s quietly built a case against one of their own, and how the evidence that finally toppled a veteran detective was, at first glance, the work of science and patience. February 24th, 1986. In a Van Nuys condominium, Sherri Rasmussen, a 29-year-old critical care nursing director, was found lying in a pool of blood. She'd been struck, bound, and shot multiple times. A bite mark was left on her arm. The initial investigation concluded the scene looked like a burglary gone wrong, a hot prowl, and despite shock and sorrow, no arrest followed. Years passed. Files cooled. The case faded to a folder on a shelf. From the start, Sherri's father believed something else. He told investigators that a former classmate of his son's, a woman who had known Sherri's husband in college, had behaved oddly around the couple. That woman was Stephanie Lazarus, who'd been in a relationship years earlier with Sherri's husband, John Retton. But the early detectives never followed that thread aggressively. Bureaucracy, misdirection, and perhaps institutional blind spots kept that lead from turning into a suspect. The result, a prime suspect who slipped through the cracks while a family waited for answers. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't just any name in the file. She was an LAPD officer, later a detective, respected in parts of the department. To many around her, she was vivacious, competent, and a dedicated cop. To others, a perfect insider, someone who knew how evidence could be handled, what records could be accessed, and how to blend into the background. That profile would make her both unlikely to be suspected and extraordinarily difficult to incriminate. Science changes cold cases. In the 1990s and 2000s, DNA technology leapt forward. The bite mark on Sherri's arm, once just a curious detail, was re-examined. Forensic analysts determined the saliva profile came from a woman, not from a male intruder, as investigators had once assumed. That revelation forced detectives to rethink the burglary theory and reopen the case with fresh eyes. Reopening the file led detectives into a tight, careful operation. They quietly appointed homicide detectives who had no personal ties to the suspect. They needed a DNA sample without tipping off an experienced officer. One day in 2009, while Lazarus was off duty, detectives discreetly obtained a discarded drink cup she had used at a public store. The DNA from that cup matched the saliva from the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen. The physical link that would transform a cold case theory into an active investigation. They planned the arrest like a chess move, recognizing what a volatile emotional reaction could occur if a fellow officer were suddenly told she was the focus. Leaders arranged for the interview to occur at LAPD headquarters. Lazarus was called in on a pretext. She entered unarmed, carrying the credibility and calm of someone used to commanding interviews. But this time, she would become the interview subject. The room was small, fluorescent lit. The trap was in the manner of the questions and in the quiet confidence of those who already held the DNA card. The interrogation video and transcripts are unnerving because of how ordinary the moment looks. Two robbery homicide detectives began by steering the conversation gently, using silence and the ordinary cadence of police questioning. Everything felt measured. When the detectives hinted they had DNA evidence, the conversation shifted. The suspect, trained in law enforcement herself, displayed a mix of disbelief, irritation, and later calculation. At one point, she reportedly asked if this was a joke, a deflection that, in the video, slices through the tension. A search warrant executed soon after turned up detail that prosecutors would later use. A mid-1980s diary in Lazarus's home, with entries that hinted at obsession over her ex and anger about his engagement and marriage. Internet searches, old notes, and detail that painted a motive beyond passion. A simmering fixation. Investigators also found that Lazarus had been off duty the day of the killing, undercutting the idea of an opportunistic burglar and building the timeline prosecutors would present to a jury. The case went to trial in 2012. The prosecution tied together the bite mark DNA match, Lazarus's presence in the defendant's orbit, the diary evidence, and other circumstantial details into a narrative. A scorned former lover, unable to accept her rival, who returned and committed a calculated violent act. The jury convicted. Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life for the Rasmussen family. Justice, long delayed, finally arrived. The story didn't end with a conviction. Questions remained about whether evidence was mishandled or removed in the early days of the investigation. Reporters and authors later described files that suggested certain leads had been downplayed, and they asked whether Lazarus's insider status shielded her from earlier suspicion. The family pursued civil claims. Internal investigations raised uncomfortable possibilities about police culture and the fallibility of institutions sworn to solve crimes impartially. Years later, changes in parole law and a mandatory review brought Lazarus before parole panels. In November 2023, she made statements acknowledging her role in the killing, a startling departure from earlier claims of innocence. A parole panel initially granted suitability, but that decision was contested by the victim's family and ultimately rescinded after review. The public debate over remorse, rehabilitation, and the scale of the crime continued. A reminder that legal resolution is rarely the same as emotional closure. So why focus on the interrogation? Because it's the moment a successful investigation turns theory into confession or contradiction. In this case, the interrogation captured a detective, someone trained to read others, suddenly in the reverse role. She was the one being read, pieced apart by questions and by the weight of a DNA match. That scene crystallizes the case's moral ironies, expertise used to protect the public, and expertise used to hide a crime. This story is about more than one murder. It is about how science can reopen old wounds, how institutions sometimes fail, and how patience and careful detective work, even decades later, can change a life sentence in a file into a life sentence in prison. It forces a hard look at trust. Trust in people who wear badges, and trust in the systems that investigate them. Sherri Rasmussen's family waited more than 20 years for a measure of justice. The files, the lab reports, and the interrogation tapes now live on as a modern cold case parable. A complex, troubling story where expertise, obsession, and evidence collided. The Interrogation of Stephanie Lazarus is not just a single room on a single day. It's the final chapter on a case that started with a knock on the door at 2 a.m. and ended with a quiet submission to the weight of proof. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into cases where the truth takes years to find. And when it does, it often arrives in the smallest detail.